he relented. He granted to Colonel Austin, who he hated with a passion, probably more than any other person. He granted him a parole, and Austin honored that parole. 4 of Austin's men were killed. Most all the others were wounded in this little firefight, but they too were paroled. And Fanning went on back to Cox Mills. In September of 1781, Fanning was augmented by Tories from Cumberland and Bladen counties, mostly Highlanders, and they made a daring raid, a surprise raid in the early morning hours on the town of Hillsborough, which was then acting as the state capital. It was probably the most prominent town in the interior of North Carolina at that time. It hadn't grown much since then either. He freed prisoners from the jail. So he captured more than 70 or 80 uniformed Continental soldiers up there in the, who were camped out. Most of them were trainees. They were camped up in this churchyard. But his biggest catch was Governor of North Carolina, Thomas Burke. He also took in and arrested several colonels, some Continental officers. The raid ended without Fanning losing a single man. In this raid, he didn't lose it. He had 1 man wounded, even though there was some resistance on the part of the Whig militia. Fanning did not sack the town or plunder the homes of residents, as has been reported by some historians. Within a few hours, he had the prisoners marching out of Hillsborough and en route to Wilmington, nearly 200 miles away. The governor was walking, along with the private soldiers. The next day, about 20 miles from Hillsborough, this force was ambushed by a Patriot militia group and with a few Continentals under General John Butler. They were trying to rescue the prisoners. This took place in Lindley's Mill. And just incidentally, Lindley, old Thomas Lindley, who owned the mill, was the father of James Lindley that Fanning served under down in South Carolina. This mill was near the current Alamance-Chatham County line on Cane Creek. It still exists today and still in the Lindley family. A fierce battle followed with many casualties on both sides, but Fanning led a flanking counterattack that forced the Patriot troops to withdraw. The prisoners then were marched on to Wilmington, where they were then shipped to Charleston, and most of them into British prison ships. Fanning was severely wounded in that fight. Both bones in his lower arm were shattered, and he lost a lot of blood. It took him quite a time to recover from that injury. He wasn't able to make the march down. But everybody was looking for him then. And the new governor of North Carolina, the acting governor, really sent out patrols trying to find him, and to no avail. During the months that followed him, and seeing loyalist families suffer from the hands of patriots and having his men hanged just because they fought for the crown, Fanning became more bitter, more vindictive. He began summary executions of captives who were parole violators or suspected of harshly treating, quote, friends of the government, end quote. He became the most feared man in central North Carolina. After Cornwallis surrendered in Yorktown in October 1781, the British abandoned their post at Wilmington. Fanning lost his critical supply base. Even though it was 180 miles away from where he was headquartered, it was still a place he could get ammunition, he could get powder, he could get balls, he could get French muskets. He was now on his own. Seeing the war was coming to an end, he sought a ceasefire and began to negotiate for fair treatment of the people who had been fighting with him. But some Randolph County Patriot leaders refused to negotiate or honor that truce. They attacked Fanning's camp. They hanged 2 of Fanning's favorite officers. Angry and in retaliation, Fanning took a small party of men, about 20 of them, I think, and visited the homes of the 5 senior-most officials in the Randolph County militia. Now, Fanning's headquarters were along Cox Mills here along Big River. He first went to the home of Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Balfour. Balfour was probably the meanest of all these people. He really hated Tories with a passion. Fanning called him out. When Balfour came out, he was shot a couple of times, but he was survived. And then he crawled back in the house, and Fanning chased him back in, kicked the door in. And there in front of Balfour's sister and 13-year-old daughter, he shot Balfour in the head, killing him instantly. Next, he went to the home of Colonel John Collier, who lived up, Collier lived right up here. Most of the others were all fairly close in together. He was the commander of the Patriot Militia in Randolph. He was also the sheriff of the county. Collier's guards he had guards unlike Balfour, and got it every morning. So he jumped out of the back window, ran off into the woods, and escaped. So in retaliation, Fanning had his house burned. All of the outbuildings and any kind of other crops that he had in storage were all burned. Before daybreak that day, Fanning's team shot dead another Patriot officer and burned 2 more houses. Then the next day, he went to the Chatham courthouse and disrupted the elections going on that was scheduled for the county. He was quite angry at that time. In his biography in North Carolina, Samuel Ash wrote Fanning that his remorseless raping and murderous execution were without parallel. Besides individual hangings and minor encounters, he had participated in 36 bloody engagements, and the plantations he had ravaged and despoiled, leaving ruin and suffering in his path, were innumerable. The General Assembly extended amnesty and pardon to all Tories after the war except 3, and Fanning was among those prescribed. His crimes and butcheries were beyond forgiveness. In all of my studies of Fanning in Central North Carolina and all, I can never find any evidence of Fanning either involved in or condoning rape or intentional harming of women and children. He believed in really the philosophy of winning hearts and minds, because he knew that without support of the populace, he could not survive. Fanning continued to operate in North Carolina for nearly a year after Cornwallis' surrender. And after learning the painful lessons earlier in the war here in South Carolina, he never allowed himself to be captured after January of 1779. He dismissed his partisan band, took a 15-year-old bride, and then moved into South Carolina, slipping through the patrols that Marion had all over the place, because he was now firmly in control of eastern South Carolina. And he evaded capture and reached Charleston before the British evacuated their last stronghold in the South. He went into exile into Canada, where he lived to be an old man. And there's some other good stories there, but we don't have time for them. Robert Wimberly, in his history of North Carolina, wrote that as a partisan leader, Fanning had no superior on either side of the Carolinas. He had all the dash and daring of Sumter, the fertility and dispatch of Marion, and the resourcefulness of Davie, without possessing, however, those qualities of moral character which made these men much his superiors. Crafty and treacherous, cruel and vindictive, sparing neither age nor sex, he openly boasted of the brutality with which he destroyed the enemies and desolated this country. Well, what a character, wasn't he? So let's get back to what I was supposed to be here, and that is talking about looking at Francis Marion and Fanning together and how they have compared. They never fought each other. It's been interesting to see if they did have a campaign. Who was the better of these two? We really don't know, because they, as I say, they never fought each other. As guerrilla fighters, both were very successful. They were highly effective in the art of irregular warfare. Their tactics were very similar. Overall, I think Marion might be a better strategist. Fanning may be a little better tactician. Neither were physically big men, and they didn't look like or act like Mel Gibson. Both had a strong sense of survival, and also the survival of their men. Unlike some commanders in those days, just that you send men into combat knowing they're going to get killed, both of them wanted to preserve the men because, particularly in guerrilla warfare, you have a limited number of people to work with, and you get somebody killed or wounded, they become ineffective, and you no longer have a body to fight. The Swamp Fox was older. He was in his early 40s there at the end of the war. Fanning was in his mid-20s. Neither of them had any formal education. Marion's on-the-job training, though, was far more extensive in both conventional and irregular warfare. You heard yesterday about his work with fighting the Indians in the war earlier. He was also a full-time officer in the state's regiments when they were organized in 1775. Neither man was married while they were fighting. They only got married afterwards. Both men were quick learners. They learned from experience. They adapted easily to fighting where there were no front lines, no marked boundaries. Marion fought on his home turf. He knew the people, he knew the terrain intimately. Fanning was new to central North Carolina and initially had depended on others for intelligence about the local populace and the area. Both men valued intelligence, good intelligence. It was essential for their survival and their success. And they had created effective spy networks in their operational areas. As a guerrilla fighter, Marion fought British regulars, probably as much or more than he fought Loyalist partisans. But Fanning, for the most part, only fought partisan militia. He did run against a few continental, but not a strong continental force. Both men were feared by their opponents and by the people who sided on the other side. As a guerrilla, Marion had no external logistical support, while Fanning had the resources of the British Army supplies in Wilmington. And again, it was still, even though he had to go 180 miles through territory that was controlled by neither side, and they were better than Whig partisans as they were Tories. They believed and they survived by living off the land and the generosity of the people who believed in their cause. They knew that without public support, they could not win, they could not survive. Marion's demeanor was cool, compassionate. Fanning was respectful at first, but eventually became bitter and vindictive. Like our modern day Special Forces soldiers, both men shared common characteristics that are essential not only in the 18th century, but in 21st century partisan fighters. Both were totally dedicated to their cause. They had the ability to lead through persuasion, and they led by setting the example. They shared all the hardships that their men had to face. They slept on the ground with them. They ate the same food when they had it. They swam rivers together, and Fanning, Marion, as you might know, could not swim, and yet he would go right into a deep river holding on to his horse's neck and swim the horse across the river. They did that to elude the enemy. They constantly tried to men recognized them exercising good judgment. They wouldn't pick fights unless they thought they had a good chance of winning. They constantly displayed courage, and it led them end up in harm's way. They were never afraid to face the enemy, to close with the enemy, or to exploit advantages. They showed initiative in all the things that they did, seizing opportunities as they occurred without worrying about them to death or calling somebody for permission. They operated independently most of the time. Sometimes they had a few orders from higher up, but most times they were on their own. Marion readily adapted to the growing support of the revolution and reverted to a more conventional warfare as the general in charge of the eastern South Carolina Whigs when Greene came into the state. Fanning adapted from being in control of an area, or mostly in control, to being on the losing side. Yet he still looked after his men before he slipped away from the area in safety in Charlestown. And both guys constantly displayed a self-confidence and a positive attitude that was essential if you're going to have people follow you. There are hundreds of fascinating true stories involving irregular operations in the American Revolution here in the Carolinas. For the most part, Carolina partisans on both sides were brave and honorable men. But there were some rogues on both sides. Some of these people were rich, some were poor, but they all shared a passion for their causes. Our time today permitted me only to just give you a short sentence, but most confrontations in that era were sparked by a pastel of hate among neighbors and within families that grew more intensive as the war became longer. It resulted in partisan fighting becoming more brutal and more savage, and people taking it hard in their position toward others. These partisan fighters, both patriots and loyalists, perfected a legacy of unconventional warfare that continues today with the U.S. Army Green Berets. Thank you. My little commercial thing here, I have a book on Kings Mountain out there. Any questions? Done a pretty good job. Yes, sir.
You know, you mentioned Fanning liked to go after the government officials, and he would attack them in the most vulnerable place in their own homes. And he tried that with my fourth grade grandfather. He was going to drag him out of his house and hang him in his front yard. But luckily for him and me, he wasn't home. Fanning ransacked his house and made off with some of his valuables.
Right. There's a lot of instances on both sides of things like that. Survival instincts take over when you see somebody coming at you that bent on killing you. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to his land on Raven Creek?
It land on Raven Creek?
Yeah, well, this little
There's
farm.
nobody found any record that he really owned that land. The conventional thinking of most people is that he was a squatter in a cabin that had been abandoned. When he was in Orange County, he was with the O'Daniels family. O'Daniels had a brother living on Raven Creek, and I think that he went there, and he probably helped him find this cabin that was either on his land or on somebody else's land. But you keep in mind, you're right on the edge of the Indian line there, when you went down in the 1770s. And and it was not uncommon at all in the Carolinas for people to squat or even build cabins on land that they never purchased or used. They stayed there for a while, and if they got run off, they got run off. If not, they would maybe try to claim it. I don't know. But there's no record of him owning any land there. There's a lot of things that, in doing my research, I find about him as a novelist. It gives me, I know where the facts are, so I fill in between all the blanks, and that makes for a good story. Yes, sir.
What did Fanning do after he got to Canada? I mean, here's a soldier that was on the losing side. You know, what the old soldier on the losing side?
When he was in Nova Scotia, he became a fairly successful farmer and a miller. Got into politics, but he ran afoul of his neighbors. Now, most of the people living where he lived were New Englanders. The New England expatriates and the Southern expatriates didn't get along very well. And he really got to a point that it got pretty bitter and pretty nasty. And he was elected to the Parliament of Nova Scotia. He was charged with rape. And he was tried, convicted, and condemned to hang. But he appealed to the governor of the province, saying that the jury were all his political enemies. It was rigged. His number one antagonist, his son, was on that jury. Some nephews were on that jury. Known friends and business associates. And so it was a rigged jury. And the governor believed him and gave him a pardon, but he forced him to leave Nova Scotia and go to New Brunswick. Christine knows more about it than I do, since that's her next question.
It's the reverse. He was a member of Parliament in New Brunswick when he got in trouble in Fredericton.
Okay, so I got the two provinces. It said he went to Nova Scotia.
And then he went to.
Yeah, okay.
But the rape involved a 12-year-old girl, and He
It
was-
supposedly happened while his wife and daughter were out picking berries or something.
Something, yeah.
There was a lot of controversy over it.